Hello, and welcome back to Voyage of a Time Wanderer. Today I am here to do my September update for the Fall Into Reading Challenge. The Fall Into Reading Challenge is hosted by 4 lovely booktubers: Tia from Tia and All the Books, Kelly from Cozy Reader Kelly, Angie from Literary Labors, and Rainy from Rainy Day Reads. And they have 2 different bingo boards. They have a 15 prompt bingo board and then they have a 24 prompt bingo board. I chose to go with the 24 prompt bingo board because you have from September to November to read books that meet up with those challenges. I'll put up my bingo board here so you can see which 10 prompts I managed to cross off in the month of September. And I thought I would do kind of a combination monthly wrap-up and Fall Into Reading Challenge update video to talk about these 10 books that I read in September. So I thought I would just go across the bingo board and talk about which prompts I have filled in. So for the first prompt, Young Adult, I read The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. This is actually the first book that I've ever read by Neil Gaiman. I know that he's a very popular author, but his style of book hasn't typically appealed to me, but I had heard a few people mentioning The Graveyard Book and saying that it was a really interesting and unique book, so I thought I would give it a try. This book follows a young boy called Nobody Owens, nicknamed Bod, and when he is just a toddler, his family is killed and he escapes into a graveyard and ends up being adopted by a family of ghosts who are trying to protect him from his family's killer, who is still on the hunt for him. And then each chapter we follow Bod as he grows up, so each chapter he's like another 2 or 3 years older, and we watch him explore the graveyard, meet different characters who have their final resting place there, and learn about himself and the outside world of living people that he will one day have to join. I listened to this on audiobook and it was narrated by Neil Gaiman himself. He did a fantastic job with the audiobook, and it was just a unique, spooky read with some sentimental passages, some tense scenes of action, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. Next up, for the graphic novel prompt, I ended up reading Jane, Le Renard et Moi, which is a French language children's graphic novel that features quite heavily Jane Eyre as a plot point. So it follows a young girl who is being bullied at school, and her only escape is the time that she has reading Jane Eyre. It has a really beautiful art style. Most of the depictions of this girl's daily life are in kind of a monotone black, brown, white color scheme, and then the passages where she's reading Jane Eyre and discussing the plot of Jane Eyre, it's in full color, and it's just really quite beautiful, those pages. I read this as a warm-up for Victober, and I highly recommend it. I think there is also an English translation available if you aren't able to read in French, and it was just a beautiful story of how a young girl can find escape in the world of a novel. Then for the historical fiction prompt, I read Charlotte by Helen Moffett. This is a Pride and Prejudice retelling, coming off of the tale of the other Bennet sister, which I read during Jane Austen July and absolutely adored. I had high hopes for this book that promised to explore what happened to Charlotte after the events of Pride and Prejudice. Unfortunately, I did find this book to be a bit of a letdown. There was definitely some beautiful passages, and I think the author has a lot of promise in her writing style. This was a debut novel, and I definitely would pick up more work by her in the future. But there was some aspects of characterization and plot points that I didn't really agree with, which I think is the danger of reading classic retellings where you already have such a solidified view of the characters and the actions that they would take and what would kind of fit with their personality. So unfortunately, I did end up giving this book 2 stars. Then for the non-fiction prompt, I read 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene, Hanff. I feel like this is a Booktube cult classic that somehow I hadn't yet got to. It's a series of letters exchanged between a woman in New York and a bookseller in London. She initially writes there inquiring, trying to get a copy of a rare book that she can't track down in the United States, and ends up having like a multi-decade friendship with the various people who are employed by this bookstore. And so the letters span not only discussions about bookish topics, but also little life updates as well. It's a very short read, but I can definitely see why book lovers love this book so much, because there is so much discussion about the nuances of finding the perfect edition of your favorite volume. I listened to this on audio, and it was a multicast audiobook, which I absolutely love, and I have a video actually coming out later this week about my favorite multicast audiobooks, because I do think that is one of the aspects of audiobooks that I enjoy the most, and I ended up giving this 5 stars. Next up, for the science fiction prompt, I read Satellite Love by Genki Ferguson. This is a debut novel by a Japanese-Canadian author, and I had first seen it discussed by Rick McDonnell over on his channel during one of his Booktube spin lists. And I don't typically read science fiction, so when I saw that this was a prompt on the bingo board, that was the first book that kind of popped into my mind. It's probably one of the oddest books that I've ever read, but also very poignant and touches on a lot of very human themes. It's set in Japan during the late 1990s, right at the turn of the millennium, and we follow a young girl who is very ostracized by her classmates and ends up kind of falling in love or forming a strong attachment to a satellite that she observes through her telescope from her bedroom window. We have chapters told by a lot of perspectives within this book. We have a lot of chapters from the girl's perspective, we have chapters from the satellite's perspective, we have chapters from the girl's grandfather's perspective, and we have some chapters from a classmate's perspective. In the end, this book does touch on a lot of deep topics, more than just kind of a pulp science fiction type novel. We're looking at loneliness, mental illness, the tensions between traditional faith and kind of modern industrial society. It's just a very bittersweet book that has an ending that definitely was haunting and stayed with me for days and days after I finished it. For the standalone prompt, I read another book set in Japan, and that is Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. I read this as part of a big buddy read hosted by Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space, and it was a thoroughly enjoyable buddy read. Lots of intelligent discussion in our Voxer group, and then we did a watch-along of the movie adaptation, so I definitely thoroughly enjoyed the experience of reading this with other people. Arthur Golden has a very beautiful writing style, a lot of descriptive passages, and clever metaphors that really help you to visualize the characters and places that he's describing. There were a few aspects of the plot and the ending in particular that I didn't love, so I ended up giving this 3 stars, but I'm so glad that I read it because it's a book that I have seen discussed ever since I was in high school age when the movie came out, and I've wanted to read it forever and never got around to it. So I'm so glad that I did finally read it this fall. I know there's some controversy about this book and whether it was Arthur Golden's place to write from the perspective of a geisha and whether or not he stole some of his material from some of the geisha that he interviewed. So I definitely want to pick up some of the nonfiction autobiographies and memoirs that have been published by former geishas to learn more about this fascinating era of Japanese history. Then for the diverse characters prompt, I read a romance novella by Alyssa Cole, and this is in her Reluctant Royals series, and that is Can't Escape Love. This book follows the sister of one of the characters in the previous novel and tells her story of finding love. She is an entrepreneur who runs a website for nerdy women who especially love this certain fictional anime series, and she struggles with insomnia, and the only person whose voice she is able to fall asleep to is this young guy who does puzzle streaming on Twitch, and it turns out that he has been hired by their local Comic-Con to design an escape room based around this anime series, but he knows nothing about the series. So they have to collaborate together to help cure her insomnia and also make his escape room a success. I absolutely loved the first book in the series, and the later books and short stories haven't quite lived up to this, but it was still a fun little romance story, so I ended up giving it 3 stars. Then for the new to me author prompt, I have read Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This was definitely my favorite book of the month. I absolutely love this book. I cannot rave enough about it. I cannot sing its praises more highly. It is an atmospheric read, very suitable for this time of year. The tension building is exquisite. The descriptive writing is absolutely beautiful, and the plot is just zany and full of twists that you don't see coming even though you think you have it all figured out within the first few chapters. This has put me on a mission to read more Victorian sensation novels, and I can't wait to read more by Mary Elizabeth Braddon especially, so this was a very successful new to me author who I think I could see becoming a favorite if I end up enjoying her other books as much as I love this one. I gave it 5 stars. It's one that I could see rereading, and it has sprung to near the top. Probably not my favorite Victorian novel ever, but very near the top, within the top 5 I think of my all-time Victorian classics. Then for the middle grade prompt, I read The Borrowers Afield by Mary Norton. I've been slowly rereading the Borrowers series this year, and it is absolutely delightful. This is the second book in the series. It was a childhood favorite series, and I actually remember that I owned my own box set, which was kind of rare because we mostly took books out of the library when I was younger, so having my own set of these books was so special. And the BBC miniseries from the 1990s is one that my sister and I watched and rewatched dozens of times growing up, so I have a lot of fond memories attached to this book. This book follows immediately on from the events of the first book, and we are following them as they struggle to survive out in the open elements. They find an old shoe to live in. I just love all the descriptions of living out in the countryside, the way they find nuts to make cups from, the way they forage berries and get water from the stream. There's just something very enchanting about this book series, and it's a childhood series that I'm pleased has been living up to my fond memories on a reread, because not all childhood favorites do, but the Borrowers series is definitely something special. I gave this 5 stars, and I'm definitely looking forward to continuing on with this series as well. And then the last book that I read for the Fall Into Reading Challenge in September was for the sequel prompt, and that is Love's Enduring Promise by Janette Oake. I remember my grandma reading Janette Oake books. I have a distinct memory of her being sick one day in bed, and we brought her some books from the library to keep her occupied while she was ill, and I remember that it was some of Janette Oake's Acadia series books. I had been having kind of a slumpy reading month in August, so when I was looking for something to kick me out of that as we entered into September, I thought I would finally try Janette Oake for myself, because I have seen some other booktubers recommend her as kind of a sweet romance, Christian romance author, and I also have these memories of my grandmother reading her books. These books are definitely not great literature, but they are sweet reads when you just want something cozy and comforting. This is part of her Love Comes Softly series, so I actually had read the first 2 books pretty much back to back. I love Amish romances to get me out of a reading slump, and this definitely had the same vibes. We're following a pioneer couple. The woman's husband had died tragically in an accident, and she unfortunately has no way to return back east before winter, and her husband hadn't had time to build a cabin. And there is a widower in this little community who has a young girl, and so they decide to get married. She can look after his daughter during the winter, and he will let her stay in his house over the winter, and they hatch a bargain that if she's not happy with this life by spring, he'll pay for her passage back on a wagon train. So that's the basic premise of the series. It's full of frontier daily life. In this book, they're very preoccupied with trying to find a teacher and a preacher for their small town, and how can they attract someone to help educate the children in the community. A lot of the stories in this book reminded me of family stories that I heard growing up about my own ancestors who pioneered in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So that aspect of it I found particularly cozy. Like I said, the writing is not incredible writing that takes your breath away, but it's an enjoyable little series that I could see continuing on with if I want a book to kick me out of a reading slump, or if I just want to read about simple daily life on the farm, gardening, cooking, sewing quilts, etc. So I gave this a 3-star, which is kind of my average rating for sweet romance style books, and I'm really glad that I tried Janette Oake, and I can definitely see myself reading more of her books in the future. So those are the 10 books that I read in September to cross off various prompts for the Fall Into Reading Bingo Board Challenge, and I'm having so much fun with this challenge, so I'm very grateful to the 4 co-hosts for putting this together and getting me to try some different genres or topics for books that I wouldn't have necessarily picked up without this challenge. Until next time, enjoy wandering through the pages of a good book. Bye.